This is the moment astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams and the world have been waiting for.
And splashdown, Crew 9 back on Earth.
Big smiles, big waves, such relief for them after what has turned out to be a most extraordinary adventure in space.
Yes, and brought back by the capsule called Freedom.
Who would have remembered Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore if their trip to space had gone to plan? But when their 8-day mission turned into 9 months, their fame shot sky high.
Butch and Suni have probably been the most paid attention to astronauts in the past 20 years. And that is not because anything was special about it other than things going wrong. Whether they wanted to or not, their mission and their activity is under more watchful eyes than it would have in any other mission.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, they've finally come back down to Earth, but this space saga is not over. So what will life be like for Butch and Suni now? Their bodies and minds are already under daily scrutiny due to the dangers of long-term space travel.
Their faces are quite puffy and blown up. They're getting loss of their vision.
How do you have the right skill set and personality to be very social, very personable, very real, but also handle these high-stress environments and not let it wear on you?
Then there are the giant leaps this mission is making for the space industry and for medicine, like fighting cancer. One of those watching Butch and Suni closely is surgeon and Auckland University space medicine researcher Dr. Lisa Brown. She tells me what's going on with these 2 days after splashdown.
They can find it quite difficult to walk. They also get a sense of spatial disorientation because the position of our body when we move on Earth is related to gravity with what we call otoliths in our inner ear. And so without gravity on the space station, they get all sort of mucked up and confused. So people can feel quite dizzy, and it can take many hours again or days for that to readapt. Many of the astronauts say the most exciting thing is actually just being able to have a shower, which they wouldn't have had for the whole time they're in space. So those things that you just, don't experience in the tin can in space.
And Lisa, there's kind of the more day-to-day things, like how they'll adjust to the food back on Earth and sleeping. You know, in space, initially getting to sleep is difficult because you're floating.
Yeah, so on the space station, they have their own sleeping quarters. Each astronaut has their own sort of very mini bedroom, and they have sort of like, you can imagine like a sleeping bag, which has various straps on it, which they strap themselves in, and that can sort of hold them in a particular place to sleep, which kind of mimics slightly, a bed, although obviously without that gravitational pull. In terms of reacclimatizing people to a sleep cycle, because the space station orbits the Earth so many times in a 24-hour period, so they get multiple sort of exposures to a day-night cycle compared to once in 24 hours that we experience. It's really important that they have a circadian rhythm. So often that's medicated in terms of using things like melatonin and very well thought out sleep schedules that are managed by their flight surgeon at NASA. So all of those things to try and help regulate that sleep cycle.
They were space test pilots. It takes a special person to be a test pilot. It takes a really special person to be a space test pilot.
Dr. Brad Tucker is an astrophysicist and cosmologist at the Australian National University in Canberra.
Saying we're going to be the first to fly this capsule in space requires a lot of willingness and a personality that is hard.
What happens to them now? I mean, do they basically go into retirement, but they're monitored on a daily basis, I believe?
So this will be interesting because they were both chosen because they're towards the end of their careers. They have had multiple spaceflight missions. It was always unlikely they were going to go into space again, even if the mission went normal and according to plan. And this is where I think part of the interesting part happens. There will be both the daily monitoring for their own health improvements and all the issues that arise from long duration spaceflight. But then at the same time, there are all the interests from the research side that people will want. Most of the medical data on human spaceflight comes from 20 to 40-year-old white male Russian and American Air Force and Navy pilots. It's a very small group of people most of the data comes from. The fact that they are older, especially for spaceflight, that they are in there for 9 months compared to the usual 6-month missions they've done. There has been a few 12-month missions. That will be interesting. So it will be interesting to see how long they're willing to do that, because once they retire from the astronaut corps and from NASA, there's no obligation for Butch and Suni to work with NASA on medical studies and research. And conversely, NASA has no right to study them without their permission. So it'll be interesting to see how actually that plays out subtly, because there is a lack of data on the very long-term effects because astronauts retire and the data gets weaker. But in this case, there's a lot that people want to know and learn from this.
How old are Suni and Butch?
59 and 62. They're not the oldest person to ever go into space, but they're very much on the end. And especially as we know with what the health effect problems are, at least some of them, a lot of them get quite exasperated. It will be interesting to see how these health effects really impact them, given what we know in space.
The thing about space medicine is that there's just so many unknowns and unanswered areas. One of the major things that happens when you're in space is obviously from the lack of gravity. And so you're experiencing what we call a microgravity, so various levels of gravity. At the moon, it's about 1/5 of that of Earth. Mars, about 1/3 of Earth. And as they're orbiting around in the space station, they're really feeling almost a zero gravity. And that lack of gravity causes complex fluid shifts in the body. So when we're walking on Earth, most of our fluid in our body tends to pull towards our feet because the gravity is pulling it down. But when you're in space, that fluid shifts, and that can happen, within hours of being in space, is that fluid redistributes around the body and can be more pulled towards our heads. So if you look at pictures of astronauts, you can see that their faces are quite puffy and blown up, quite spherical and red, and that's because of all that fluid redistribution. And because of that, that can cause changes in the way that our heart functions in space. It changes the output that our heart pumps out and make our lungs slightly more full of fluid and slightly harder to breathe. One of the things that's really being investigated is something called SANS, or Spaceflight Associated Neuroocular Syndrome. And that's where people that have experienced quite a significant time in space, usually over about 6 months, we're finding that they're getting a change in terms of a loss of their vision. None of it has been determined to be permanent as yet, but it's a change which slowly returns after many months back on Earth. And the actual cause of that is currently still unknown, and it's one of the big research areas currently in space medicine, but potentially is caused by that fluid shift and extra fluid going up into the head. When people come back down to Earth, usually these fluid shifts change over several days to weeks to months and return back to the normal distribution. But we can use the data learnt from space to apply it back to health of people on Earth, so what we call translational medicine. So a lot of those fluid shifts, like I said, that affect the heart, that can be akin to cardiomyopathy, which people experience on Earth. And so a lot of that research that's been done in space can be translated back to try and help people back on Earth.
And we do hear about radiation exposure and the increased risk of cancers and degenerative diseases like cataracts. Is that part of your research?
Yes, so as well as in Auckland, I'm also supervising some medical students at the University of Melbourne, and they're currently doing research into the effects of radiation specifically on the skin and the incidence of skin cancer. And we know that astronauts have quite a high rate of melanoma or non-melanomatous skin cancers such as squamous cell carcinoma. In New Zealand and Australia, compared to the rest of the world, we also have very high rates of skin cancer. And so we're looking at the similarities between space travel and ionizing radiation, and also how we could use knowledge gained from that in terms of helping people again back on Earth. The other thing about radiation and what we call carcinogenesis, or the development of cancer, is that with increased exposure, so the longer that you're in space and the amount of ionizing radiation that you're exposed to, such as going to Mars, the increased risk of developing cancers. And again, as a liver surgeon, there's been thought that there's increased risk of damage to the liver and change in the liver in terms of developing what we call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And then that can progress to things like primary liver cancer, like hepatocellular carcinoma. So that's another area of my interest of research and trying to think about how we can try and prevent those sorts of things with space travel.
So, Brad, what about psychologically? You know, I have seen a few videos of them and they just seem such well-adjusted people who could basically, you know, take anything that was thrown at them. I just wonder, you know, is life going to be just really boring for them?
I think this is the really untold part of the story. They were chosen because they had been into space multiple times and they were cool customers, so that if something went wrong, again, in this really stressed environment, they would be able to adapt. And there's already a huge amount of psychological issues, measurements that they have on space flight because you're in an isolated, contained environment, ice. And so there's a lot of stresses. You know, think about during COVID lockdowns and how everyone wanted to get out. Well, they've been stuck in there for 9 months. You can't really just pop outside. You're stuck with each other. But you've also dealt with all these stresses and all these unknowns, which, you know, again, they're selected for a reason that they're able to do this. But that transition then back to Earth, you know, after a couple of weeks, they're going to have to wake up and make breakfast and get stuck in traffic going to work. You know, it is a huge change in your mental state of being shifting from that. And some astronauts have struggled a bit with that. You can get some levels of depression and anxiety that build up. It's hard to say how strong that is because, again, a lot of these people often come from some sort of medical and or military background, plus the astronaut training. So the willingness to talk about that is probably low. And I don't think you will ever see them complaining about it, but there's this very real toll that it has on them and their families. And again, as much as they prepare for this, they weren't really expecting to miss Christmases and holidays and birthdays.
You know, we left our families a little while ago.
My daughter's, I'm going to miss most of her senior year in high school, my youngest daughter. And my oldest daughter's a sophomore at East Texas Baptist University.
You know, going away parties and all these sorts of things. You know, think about how often we schedule our lives, and all of that just went out the window without them really having a say on it and their families having a say on it.
Is it a high-stress environment on a daily basis up there?
Less so than it used to be, and that's because NASA is very good at regulating the activity and the schedules, building in downtime and less stress situations. But you still do live overall in a stressful environment. You do have the occasional risk of things like space junk potentially hitting the space station and needing to evacuate. That happens. That actually happens more often than we realize now. When they were originally launched as well, they didn't take a lot of personal effects. So you're often given a weight quantity of how many personal effects you can take. So this is like your downtime. It'd be like if you got stuck going onto a long haul flight and you didn't have a book and because you didn't bring anything, and then the in-flight movie's broken. What are you going to do? You know, what are you going to have in this downtime? That was their very early stages. They did get their personal supplies up later. So there is a lot of stress, and there is a lot of really rigid routine that they have to go through daily.
Are you hearing anything about how well they have handled this, or is it all positive stuff?
It is all positive stuff, and I think you would hear nothing else differently. Not that no one's covering up anything, but I don't think they're going to fully say how they're feeling. They're also, I think, realizing that the whole world has been watching them. And I think they're very conscious of that. And NASA's very conscious of that as well. Butch and Suni have probably been the most paid attention to astronauts in the past 20 years. And that is not because anything was special about it other than things going wrong. Much like Apollo 13, you know, if you ask people who was on Apollo 11, you can probably name Neil Armstrong. Maybe you'll answer Buzz Aldrin or Michael Collins. Yeah. Who was on Apollo 12?
Can't tell you.
Yeah, no one knows. Exactly. Because no one paid attention. But Apollo 13... People remember the movie.
Yeah, yes. Well, exactly.
And because you got focused, and during the real time, people got focused on that event because it was something we could relate to. And I think that's the case with Butch and Suni. They have known, whether they wanted to or not, their mission and their activity is under more watchful eyes than it would have in any other mission.
So we really don't know what life is going to be like for them, and we may never know the truth because of course they're not ordinary people, but they kind of come across like that, don't they?
They do. And when we think about how are astronauts chosen and why there's these huge selection process and training, it's for this reason. They called it the right stuff back in the Apollo days and the Gemini missions, but it's really, how do you have the right skill set and personality to be very social, very personable, very real, but also handle these high stress environments and not let it wear on you. There are few people, as much as we all like to say we handle stress and change, it's hard no matter what it is. And sometimes there's just that right trigger and we don't do well, or we don't cope, or it hits us harder than others. Here, you know you're going to have stresses. You know you're going to have problems, in addition to a very extreme environment and a very isolated, different environment. Because when things go wrong in space, they usually never go a little wrong. There's no such thing as minor problems in space. It always requires a lot of work to fix, even if it's not catastrophic. So to have that ability to just be able to go with it and adapt it, knowing that decisions you're making generally are at the risk of potential life or vast equipment, but yet keep a smile on your face, knowing that you're happy doing it, and that's what you want to do. That takes a special person.
In an interview with Suni Williams, she said she's got on her armband of her spacesuit, she's got the word believe. And that's taken from the TV show Ted Lasso. I mean, how down to earth is that?
It is. And you would not expect that, right? Why would you have Ted Lasso as your source of inspiration in space? It feels like it should be the other way in that scenario. But they're very real and they're very human. And again, I think this is one of the reasons why this story has been so captivating. This isn't a gyroscope on the mission affected the orbital spacecraft, and therefore the thrusters also weren't misfiring correctly, and therefore they couldn't dock properly. That's really boring, and everyone just kind of tuned out as I was talking about that. It is a story of humans having to endure an unknown situation due to extenuating circumstances well beyond their control.
What difference does this mission make to the future of space travel?
There's a couple of interesting things I think that will be of consequence. Firstly, we have to start with Boeing. NASA contracted Boeing and SpaceX to build capsules. Boeing is now no longer closer for it to enter service. So there's a big weight right now still lurking over Boeing. You then have the built-in aspect that there's a new U.S. administration involved, both as the president as also the NASA administrator that will come in. What will their views be on the situation with Boeing? NASA still, from an operational level, wants multiple groups running multiple capsules. So does it affect SpaceX to build more capsules? How regular do you make these space flights? What does this mean going into the future? The International Space Station will only be around for about 5 years. It's scheduled to be deorbited in 2030. At that time, the belief is private sector space stations will come online. How does NASA view the policies with those and the safety operations and the backups?
Even though they were up there for 9 months and they insist that they weren't stranded, they weren't stuck or abandoned, would this mission be considered a success story?
I think yes and no, and it depends on who you're being successful about. To Boeing, I think the mission has been very unsuccessful. This is how this whole scenario unfolded. Boeing was trying to do their very first human test flight, their orbital test flight, a crew test flight. Boeing and SpaceX started at the same time, roughly, and were neck and neck in this kind of race of who was going to be the first commercial company to ferry astronauts to space. And SpaceX raced ahead. Boeing fell behind and has been plagued by problems in their Starliner development. And then it really came to a very public visibility when they had these thruster issues. They couldn't solve the thruster issues on space. And then NASA essentially had to say, we don't trust it enough in the risk matrix to get it back, and we're going to have to come home empty. But on the other side, NASA's ability to have other crews and other capsules go up, because they weren't stuck there, but it required a huge amount of logistic reshuffling. It's as if someone didn't come into work, so you've had to shuffle all the overtime schedules and roster rotations to get it done, to make sure that the normal services can resume and the normal operations can resume and get back in a normal sequence. So, and to that case, the ability for NASA to adapt to solving everyone's needs, essentially, for the most part, is a success story.
All right, we want to take you now to West Texas, where Blue Origin is getting ready for its 9th space tourism flight.
We're standing in front of a mock-up of our space tourism capsule. The capsule itself is designed to carry 8 customers and 2 crew.
As our 4 civilian astronauts will orbit the Earth for 3 days before splashing down in the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, with space tourism on the trajectory, and given what experts know about the health risks to astronauts, I asked Lisa how dangerous it is for tourists.
First of all, it depends what sort of experience they're going to have. So if it's a sort of short suborbital flight, things like Virgin Galactic, and they're not going to be experiencing a long time in microgravity. So the risk of things like radiation exposure and the fluid shifts and things wouldn't be such a problem. But things that they will experience is G-force in terms of the launch and that short period of weightlessness and potential disorientation. So there are highly trained medical teams that are working with each of those companies. And many of those spaceflight participants are going through medical checks and training before they go, to check their heart. They might do some training in a centrifuge, which is where they get spun around quite fast to experience the G-force and just make sure that they're okay and don't experience any cardiac arrhythmias and things like that. And those medical teams are publishing guidelines for what they think would be potential medical conditions which people might be diagnosed with that might rule them out in terms of being safe for doing flight like that. In terms of a more longer duration like space tourism, which, may happen in the future in hotels on the moon, space medicine will be constantly being changed and figuring out ways to try and help people and mitigate these effects. And definitely there have been people who have had underlying medical issues who have gone to space for space tourism, some medical things which have had to be fixed before they went. Potentially things could be overcome so people could go if they really wanted to.
And what does all this mean for space medicine in New Zealand?
With the rocket launches and things, we've proven that to the international community that New Zealand is really a big player in space. And in terms of space health specifically, with our New Zealand Space Health Research Network, which is managed, like I said, through the University of Auckland, we're pulling together all that expertise of different researchers we have, and which might not have been classically space fields, but are kind of pulling their research towards space and how that could be used with that real focus on translational medicine. So I think New Zealand has a lot to offer, and I think that's quite exciting for growth of the sector.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. Thanks to Lisa Brown and Brad Tucker. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.